So welcome to everyone to this book launch seminar on the Medieval Inquisition. I'm Anthony Lappin. I'm one of the editors of Medieval Monographs, and we're really delighted to have published Don's edition of the Summa contra Hereticus. And I'd also like to give my thanks to our three presenters today, Christine, Klaus-Bernward and Reima, who are going to give short presentations, around 10-15 minutes each. We'll have a few questions after that. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat and I'll try and ask them. And we're going to go rigorously through alphabetical order. So we'll start with Christine, move on to Klaus-Bernward, and end with Reima, and then Don will say a few words in conclusion. So I'll hand over to Christine, who's well famous now, I think, with her amazing book on heresy. And that's all we really have to say. Anyway,
thank you. Thank you. I am going to read, so I apologize in advance for my lack of eye contact. Wow, I don't know what to do after that. So Don's edition of Peter's Summa once again establishes him as the heir of a great Dominican scholar. I'd like to congratulate him and to thank our host for the invitation to participate. In my time, I will just raise briefly 3 questions on 13th century inquisitions about which I've been thinking lately. First, how did 13th century inquisitions serve as conduit between 12th century fantasy and 14th century reality for the boni homines? Everyone listening is surely familiar with the debate between skeptics and traditionalists on the reality of dualist heresy in the 12th century. Yet it is generally agreed that by 1300, there were indeed heretics of the sort that some historians have long called Cathars, quote unquote. As we see in the dossiers of Inquisitor Geoffroy d'Ably and Bishop Jacques Fournier, good men Père Autier and his brother Guilhelm, Prade Tavernier, and Guillaume Bellibaste then sought to sustain and to enlarge a dualist church. Even if we agree with the skeptics about troubled evidence for 12th century dualism, we must still concede that what was clerical fantasy in the 12th century appears to have truly existed by the 14th. What role did Inquisition itself play in this realization? While Mark Gregory Pegg famously used Toulouse 609 to argue for the post-Albigensian Crusade inquisitorial manipulation of Occitan customs into heresy, R.I. Moore has been friendlier towards the 13th century existence of dualism. Père Autier's grandfather may himself have been a good man, linking the mid-1240s to 1300. Yet more certain in helping to establish the movement by 1300 is that at the end of the 13th century, some southern French heretics, including Père Autier, spent time in Lombardy. It served as a kind of apprenticeship, learning heresy from what was then a declining but still healthier community of dualist heretics. As Père Autier told Shepherd Pierre Maury, "I went to seek truth, and when I found truth and I was placed in firm faith, then I came back to these parts." From another direction, the financial accounts of Tommaso da Gorzano, inquisitor in Genoa and Alessandria at the start of the 14th century, demonstrate heretical and inquisitorial contacts between northern Italy and Toulouse. Key here is that heretics trekked to Lombardy in order to find a less hostile inquisitorial environment. As Raymond Roussel said, trying to persuade Beatrice Leglise to abandon her family and run off with him to Italy, those good Christians live in Lombardy because they do not dare to live here, because the wolves and dogs persecute them, telling her that the wolves and dogs were the bishops and Dominicans who persecuted good Christians and drove them from these parts. In addition to strengthening these bonds, encouraging dualist tutorials from Lombardy, and thereby boosting dualism in southern France, 13th century Inquisition also offered its own kind of instruction. Since the 12th century, ecclesiastics and inquisitors had been telling people what heretics believed and did. Julien Thierry has proposed a, quote, perverse implantation, unquote, in which some persons adopted the dualist heresy long shopped by ecclesiastics. R.I. Moore, likewise, has commented that, quote, over time, that conviction of evil and its agents may also have been self-fulfilling, unquote, in engendering heresy. The notions of heresy circulated by the 13th century's decades of Inquisition, remember, the chief meeting point for heresiology and the laity, may have been simply appealing. More specifically, Inquisition may, as Malcolm Lambert and M.H. Vicaire suggested, have led heretics eventually to foreground dualism, both rhetorically and theologically. Again, how a leap was made from dualist fantasy to dualist reality is only a mystery for those of us who doubt the existence of Catharism before the Albigensian Crusade. But there is a broader question. Can we take more seriously 13th century heresy inquisitions as creative rather than destructive for real and not imagined or constructed heresy? And more generally, creative for and influential upon lay religious mentalities. Second, how did 13th century inquisitions embed and expand roles for lay people, and what does that tell us? Continuing from the above, scholarship on heresy inquisitions have generally resisted viewing them as collaborative, as a genuine community enterprise or expression, or as a task in which lay people at all social and economic levels engaged. To do so would shift the gravity of guilt in heresy's persecution in perhaps unwelcome or disconcerting ways, and would pivot dramatically away from every trend in the topic's historiography. Even our skeptics generally maintain the traditional opposition between clergy and laity in medieval heresy and inquisition. One the targeters and the other the targets, the people who were doing the persecuting and the people whose culture, behavior, and mood were being recast through treatises and trials as heresy. Yet can we confront repressive heresy inquisitions with their unquestioned dynamics of religious intolerance, illiberalism, repression, and violence, not as attached to a tightly bounded clerical monoculture, but rather as a project of multiple cultures, statuses, and classes? For continuing a pre-Albigensian Crusade trend, the near simultaneous introductions of heresy inquisitions in southern France and northern Italy encompassed various tasks for secular authorities and lower level lay people. The sources for these diverse lay roles in eradicating heresy are abundant and varied: manuals, trial transcripts, canon law, financial accounts. Nobles, civic officials, and average citizens alike swore oaths to fight heresy. Lay lawyers provided written consilia. Layman Zancina Ugolini wrote an inquisitor's manual. Layman Salva Berci and one Georgius wrote anti-heretical polemics. On a daily basis, lay people served as Inquisition's arresters, notaries, and jailers. Those jailers, by the way, included lay women. Inquisitors sent lay servants on various inquisitorial errands. Perhaps the most intriguing role for laymen is as members of the councils that met to advise inquisitors on sentencing the guilty, which appear in France, Italy, and Aragon. Brief hints of this practice in the 1240s became even bolder a generation later, after pronouncements from Popes Innocent IV, Alexander IV, and Clement IV in the 1250s and 1260s. The visibility of sentencing advisors only increased throughout the later 13th century and into the 14th. While laymen were a minority in these sentencing councils, they did participate with clergy as equals. A few general points to make about this diverse lay involvement in inquisitions. First, rather than constituting a 13th century innovation, it instead meant continuity with the past. It was the direct heir of peace of God councils and crusades in the East, and it resulted from exactly the same genius: lay duties and lay ecclesiastical collaboration in pursuit of often regional spiritual goals. Likewise, it served as another intriguing example of post-reform hybridity in medieval lay religious roles. It wasn't a priest who warned the dying Arnaud Tesser that he was in spiritual danger, quote, begging him to tell the truth about the things imputed to you about heresy. Do you want to confess your sins? It was layman Marc Revel, who with his wife Esclarmonde ran the inquisitorial jail of Alamans in Pamiers. More importantly, these various lay roles publicly presented heresy inquisitions, however unsuccessfully, as a community enterprise. The use of laity in the sentencing councils especially sought to communicate a sense of community justice that theoretically resolved Inquisition's inherent and controversial uncertainty in judgment, and, just as theoretically, prevented resistance to particular prosecutions. But we might ask if all means of lay involvement in heresy inquisitions were a retention or maybe a new manifestation of the local community as the source of justice and order, that is, of a localized juridical sensibility that was supposedly lost when a centralized inquisitio replaced earlier legal methods. The more tantalizing question is what, if anything, characterized lay people as persecutors of heretics? We are naturally attracted to the easier to perceive clerical perspectives and, in my case, Dominican inquisitorial mentality. But was there a lay Christian anti-heretical mentality? And did 13th century Inquisition itself influence it through, say, its instructive capacity? Did such a mentality resemble that of Dominicans and other ecclesiastics? Inquisitors could compel lay assistance and participation in inquisitions. But we should acknowledge that many medieval lay people genuinely supported pursuing heresy, excuse me, or, and perhaps this is worse, they were simply apathetic about it, a job just like any other. As Don remarks in his introduction to Peter's Summa, this was a, quote, tense, exciting, and dangerous time during a clash of ideas and worldviews, unquote. We can only fully understand this clash if we reject as exhaustive and absolute the anthropological two cultures model, dividing those worldviews sharply between clerics and laity that has thus far driven our historiography. Third and last, a question not limited to the 13th century. How will the study of medieval heresy inquisitions evolve in the West amid de-Christianization? 25 years ago, Richard Bulliet observed that, quote, medieval Islamicists with Western cultural backgrounds study a past culture and society of which they, for the most part, are not heirs, and one that many of the world's Muslims believe still informs their daily lives, unquote. Amid the rise of the religiously unaffiliated in both the United States and Europe, and an observable decline of Christianity in the United States, we might ask how the study of medieval Christianity will alter when generally its practitioners are like Bulliet's Western Islamicists, disassociated from any sense of inheritance or of connection to the present vibrant reality of Christianity's modern adherents. This is not to say, of course, that either when Bulliet made this remark or today, all scholars of medieval Christianity were studying their own religious or cultural inheritance or shared a meaningful connection to lived Christianity in the present. But in 1995, it was possible for another medievalist to say, again, even if some then disagreed, that our professional task was to, quote, help others understand the threads that came together to form the dominant culture of our age, a culture profoundly influenced by the Christian religion, unquote. Such a description of medieval studies now seems less viable. But as the historiography of medieval Christianity in the West increasingly redefines itself as the study of a past culture and society of which its practitioners are not heirs, there may be particular ramifications for how we understand heresy inquisitions. Inquisition historiography was born amid competing visions of Christianity, and its analysis has often been deeply colored by moralizing judgments, whether valorizing it as protecting the true faith or condemning it as proof medieval Latin Christianity was hollow or hypocritical. That analysis was then largely, if variably, infused with a sense of continuity and investment. Yet if Christianity itself becomes the strange, the other to medievalists in the West, I am thinking here of Philip Larkin's forecast of a country church as, quote, a shape less recognizable each week, a purpose more obscure, unquote. What happens to Inquisition? That thing by which, to use Lord Acton's words, medieval Christians stand or fall? Does Inquisition become something we regard as dispassionately, as, say, human sacrifice among pre-Christian Bretons, something no longer required to serve as referendum on a now anodyne faith? Or, on the other hand, would Inquisition chiefly indicate to scholars that Christianity, even in the so-called Age of Faith, needed structures of figurative and literal force in order to sustain itself, an early stage in a longue durée process of de-Christianization? Or does it simply look smaller, more insignificant, less interesting, just another historical exercise of power and persecution, a perennial human habit that has, in achieving the secular modern, found other excuses than religious faith? Those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Christine. That's a huge set of questions. I think perhaps maybe we should just go straight on to Klaus-Bernward, and we'll gather all the questions up at the end.
All right. I'd say I'm not that well versed in the 13th century, as I'm mostly a scholar of the German Inquisition, which was very brief in the 1230s. Konrad von Marburg, just as a hint to Christine, who was murdered by a lay person. And let's say the princes took objection. Naturally. And the idea that, let's say, Konrad, no Dominican, and a Franciscan, his aide, were murdered, is lay involvement, is, let's say, one of the many causes where lay people took action and went against people they thought, they claimed, they thought they knew were heretics, and often killed them, or at least persecuted them, threw them out of the city. What's, let's say, my point I want to bring in is there is always a plurality. And I believe, or I find it difficult to put, let's say, things to one point only. There were, let's say, there was an inquisitor in the beginning of the 15th century who refused to do the Inquisition. He said, I've got no time for it. Even when a bishop asked him to come to his city and investigate. There were brutal inquisitors. There were, professors who were charged with the Inquisition, but rather wrote treatises, tracts on the Inquisition. There were, let's say, lay people involved in inquisitorial procedures. Officially, they needed not only notaries and scribes and soldiers, and but also university staff. But on the other hand, there were those who weren't involved too much or tried to stay outside. So my point is, let's see, when you generalize, you do always some injustice to at least some people. I'd say the Inquisition, as you all know, changed the Inquisition in the 13th century was not how it was done in the 15th century. Let's say, for instance, I'd say the importance of princes of got much bigger. Let's say the church role, or the role of the church, was diminishing. And in the case of Germany, after Protestantism came up, the treaty of, or the peace of 1555 done in Augsburg didn't end the Inquisition, but it ended persecuting heretics, because most of them claimed simply they were Protestants, covered by the treaty, and couldn't be persecuted anymore. And let's see, the power of princes, the power of the emperor, in a way, limited the Inquisition, limited in some places, again, is not true of the Dutch areas. So I see a big conglomerate of different things, sometimes happening simultaneously. And let's see, Peter Martyr's Summa is very clear cut. He has biblical references, he has references to authorities, it's in one structure. But let's say, reality is very plural. Mild inquisitors, brutal inquisitors, laity that's active against lay people, laity that's active in, let's say, condemning and working in a way with the Inquisition, up to a couple of brotherhoods and inquisitores set up that brotherhood against witches, for instance, and on the other hand, those who abstain, but weren't entirely on the suffering side. And there were those who were persecuted, who suffered, but it's not, let's say, even if the Inquisition had a definite object, they treated nobility differently. They fought against those who they could get, sometimes easily, but on the other hand, they even persecuted archbishops, or and at other times there were those who acted against princes, but rarely ecclesiastical authorities. And I still, let's say, struggle to put that plurality into one context, or that there is, let's say, a narrative, that there is a stringent explanation that covers at least most of it. All right, that's my part, my interest, my question. Oh, all right.
Okay, should we proceed on?
Yes, thank you, Klaus-Bernward. That was marvelous. We'll move on to Reima now then. Reima, if you would.
Yes, certainly.
Sorry, Reima, we'll just advertise your book, The Heresy in Late Medieval Germany, Petrus Winkler and the Waldensians, which is available from York University Press, rather than Medieval Monographs, but
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that also gave my background. So I've studied the late 14th, early 15th century German Inquisition, but it relates to Peter's Summa, and I enjoyed reading it very much because in the late 14th century, in completely different context, there is a kind of a revival through Celestian Provincial Peter Zwicker's work of this kind of a debating theological polemics against heretics. So, and Zwicker's direct stylistic model is Moneta of Cremona, treatise he was familiar with, and obviously, as we learned from your book, Peter of Verona's Summa was not so influential. So in my presentation, I will give some of my thoughts based on reading this, and first try to provide the context of this work, and then I will say some words about the question of authorship of the text, and then maybe some minor remarks in the end. But first, I have to congratulate you. This is marvelous work, and I have to stress that it's very, very important to have a full polemical treatise edited, but also translated in English, so that for teaching purposes, we usually have only selected pieces of these works, even the juicy bits, which are polemical and hostile, or then the parts describing heresies. But what is often left out are the long quotations from Bible and other authorities, which, as you have also said in your introduction, they actually form the major part of this work. So now actually also students can suffer reading the dozens of pages of biblical quotes that are essential part of any major polemical treatise. But as you say, Peter Martyr's Summa is actually fun to read. He's very engaging author, and he very often reminds us about how wicked the heretics are. So there are many hostile statements there amidst the theological argumentation. So as you say in your introduction, one of perhaps the most important context is the early 13th century engagement with heresy by Dominicans and other preachers. So in the context where there were actual debates and disputations with heretics, which then tends to disappear. And I find it convincing what you say, that Peter's Summa is based on, at least partially, based on actual engagements with and debates with heretics, and that his goal is to provide others who end up in similar situations with his arguments and all the authorities. And so it is similar to Moneta of Cremona's massive Summa, and it is born in the same northern Italian context. But I also would like to compare it to Durand of Huesca's, the Waldensians' works, Liber contra Manichaeos, Liber anti Heresis, which are very, very similar, also based on debating and also intended to provide others the rational arguments and authorities. But in addition to this, I read parts of the Summa as an early justification of Inquisition of heresy, and especially the marvelous chapter in the book 3, chapter 35, titled that earthly justice is good and ordained by God, but I really read it as a biblical justification of Inquisition, of heresy. And I mean, it's bold. It's I mean, Peter Martyr boasts about sending heretics to the pyre. It is really something, and I recommend that everyone should read at least that chapter, and it is very valuable to have that for the study of early Inquisition and the self-definition of Dominicans as inquisitors. That was very interesting. Then there is the question of authorship. I have myself dwelled on the subject of identifying an author to an anonymous work, and also recently I've been working somewhat with computational authorship attribution, stilometry. So this question interests me greatly. And Don offers convincing proofs that Peter Martyr, Peter of Verona, is the most probable author of this Summa. But I still see that even in the title, you leave some reservation. It is Summa attributed to Peter Martyr. But for those who have not read the book, there is obvious Northern Italian context for this text. The author seems to have been an inquisitor in Lombardy in 1230s. The author obviously had some liberal arts education, which Peter Martyr had from Bologna before joining the Dominican order. There are attributions referring to him in the two preserved manuscripts. They are later than the time of its composition, but still they are evidence. And most importantly, there are very few other authors who would be possible options, or if they are, their writing style is very different. So yes, I would agree that this attribution is as solid as many attributions of medieval text, and more solid than some attributions we tend to accept. I contemplated on the possibility of running computational authorship attribution to Peter's text, but the problem is, of course, that if I read your introduction correctly, the only safely attributable text to Peter of Verona is a short letter. There are no other. Yeah, then the results would be indecisive, even if we were to do that. I mean, if there would be some longer theological work by him, then it would be possible to see if the two texts resemble each other in a quantitative way. But in this case, I mean, the only thing that could be done is to definitely exclude some other possible Dominican authors by proving that their style is different. But so that is often the case with medieval authors. The computational stilometry is a wonderful tool, but it requires some background material to work with. There is only one objection in my mind to Peter of Martyr's authorship, and that is his status as a saint. So if there were the two manuscripts, and if they were preserved in convents that also preserved Peter's memory, and especially as you propose as a possibility, if the Perugia manuscript was used in Inquisitio in Partibus of Peter Martyr, so after that, a text by a saint would have become a cherished object by the communities, even a relic. So I think that it's more probable. I still find Peter's authorship convincing, but I think it's more probable that all memory of his of the connection between the text and the author had been forgotten by 1250s. Otherwise, I would have thought that they would have preserved the manuscript as a venerated object. Okay, those were my main points and questions, but some minor remarks that came to my mind when reading and relating to the big question of did there exist dualist heretics Cathars in early 13th century? There are some interesting remarks by Peter Martyr. For example, in page 25 on your edition, he speaks of perfecti nostri credentes nostri, which we regard as inquisitorial categories. But this is a very early date for such nominations, 1230s. So there rises a question if they are inquisitorial or dissident categories. Of course, Peter was an inquisitor, so it simply would seem that the inquisitor used these terms in northern Italy already then. And then there is, of course, should we call these heretics as Cathars? Moneta of Cremona is an early example of wide use of the term Cathar, but also it seems that Peter Martyr, I found several occasions in the text where, although he usually uses Patarine as the name for the dualist heretics, but he also speaks of Cathars, and even in one place says de patare norum seu Catharorum erroribus, clearly stating that in his mind these two groups were identical. So it brings up the question of whether or not they actually used the term in northern Italy in the first half of the 13th century. Interesting enough, it seems that Peter does not call the heretics he encountered as Manichees. I only found few examples of he saying that some errors come from the ancient Manichees, but he does not speak of Manichees as when speaking about the contemporary heretics. Okay, so those were my observations and questions. Thank you very much. It was fun to read that excellent edition of an important work.
Thank you, Reima. I think the best thing to do is to hand over to Don now to answer those questions. Although before we do, I'll just advertise Don's new book as well. Apart from the Summa contra Hereticos, he's also published an epoch-making book on Thomas Aquinas, I'm told, a historical, theological, and environmental portrait, published by Paulus Press, but only 404 pages, so not nearly as long as this. Over to you, Don.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm so grateful, really grateful to all these esteemed panelists for coming out and spending time. Christine's work and career has always been a model and an inspiration to me. I'm still waiting with bated breath for her food and wine book to come out. I'm really excited about that and have been for a long time. Klaus-Bernward work on the history of the Dominican order in Germany has been so important. I'm working on a history of the Dominican order, and he has done so much of the important legwork for me that I'm very, very grateful for that. And Reima, thank you so much. Your work on Waldensianism in Germany has contributed so much to our knowledge of heresy and Inquisition in Northern Europe. It's always interesting to read about Inquisition in France and Germany and outside of the area where I know better. I'm so consistently impressed by the fantastic medieval scholarship coming out of Finland in recent times. I don't know what happened. I guess it's just too cold up there, so you just have to spend all your time doing great medieval scholarship. Thank you to Medievum and to Anthony Lappin, who not only organized this seminar, but served as a patient, careful, sometimes brutal editor, and also a very, very good friend. This was a project that lasted over a decade. I'm actually 3 projects past Peter of Verona, but it's fun to come back and consider him and his career. So many good questions raised by the panelists. I was really interested in Christine's first question about the laity. I think that she is right on about the collaboration of the laity and the dialogic nature of the relation between the inquisitors and the laity. One of my projects has been to try to connect these inquisitorial resources, these theological texts, to narrative sources, hagiographic sources, the sermonic canon, to confraternities, as Klaus-Bernward was pointing to. The laity and the Inquisition, I think, collaborated very fruitfully. And it's really only in the 1280s and later that you start to see a lot of tension between the Orthodox laity and the Inquisition. I think that's a marvelous area for examination, is why that schism begins to take place. Father Augustine, who I think is here, Father Augustine Thompson, has speculated that a division between orthodoxy and orthopraxis starts to drive a wedge between the two later in the 1280s, and I think that's worthy of more research. As for her deeper question about the implications of Inquisition study today, that's a big question. I know that's one she's wrestled with for a long time, and it's one we all need to confront, to see, because the thing is, even in this post-Christian society, we still see this fascination with the medieval period, something Klaus-Bernward has traced in the Reformation, the Enlightenment. We still seem to be transfixed by this medieval period, no matter where we are in our intellectual or cultural history. And so trying to get to the roots of that is very important. But as for her, where the future direction of Inquisition studies is going, the advantage of being a historian is that you don't always have to be a prophet. So I don't have to, I can't always look forward with the same kind of ability that I can sometimes look to the past with. Klaus-Bernward is absolutely right with the multiple medieval realities. This is one perspective from the 1230s in a particular context, as Reima was speaking about, but it's also one that sees a lot of intersections with the laity, intersections with the Dominican order, with the university culture, and with medieval heretics, no matter how fluid or conventionalized their views could be. As Christine pointed out, there's this debate between sort of realists and idealists about whether medieval heretics existed. I sort of fall on the realist. I think there were actual real medieval heretics. And when you look at all of the sources together, rather than just the theological or inquisitional sources, I think that becomes more clear, given the fact of the fluidity of belief and the conventionalization of Cathar belief that Peter even refers to in this document. Heretical believers would go through the Catholic motions because they believed the sacraments to have no effect. This enabled them to live side by side with their neighbors and to continue to believe in their particular systems, which may have led later to that schism that I talked about between orthodoxy and orthopraxis among the later medieval laity. Reima, your comments were really great. I think this picture of the Inquisition at this point in time, the snapshot, as it were, is really indicative of what's of a development, a transition from, and I even call it a charismatic Inquisition during this period that was as much preaching and disputation as it was formal investigation. We see the legal procedures just then developing. There's something different about the Inquisition pre-1252, before Peter's murder in Ad Extirpanda. And I wish we could have more analysis of that. We don't have the kind of manuals and discrete inquisitional records that we start to get in droves in the late 13th century and then proceeding into your periods in the 14th and 15th century. And so some serious evolution is taking place here. One of the reasons why I think the laity is so cooperative with the Inquisition is because of this early orientation. It's related to the peace of God movements, as Christine said. It's related to the Crusade, but particularly to this dynamic new preaching that's happening from Franciscans and Dominicans that is extremely popular. And so all of that is bound up together. I also think this, and Moneta for that reason, from a intellectual historical perspective, is underappreciated because these are some of the first ecclesiological treatises we have in the history of the church, where people are being forced to confront what the church is for the first time, something that's going to just expand dramatically in the 14th and particularly the 15th century. And so here we have, particularly in the book 3 that you mentioned, a real meditation on what the church means, what the heretics say about the church. We get some of the early references to the Roman church as the whore of Babylon and things like that here. And that's only going to multiply as we get into the 15th century and the 16th century. So more attention needs to be paid to that. I was forced to put attributa in the title by my editor. I may have been a little more cavalier had that not been imposed upon me, but I think that was fair. I think I got about 90% sure that this was Peter's. In response to your particular objection, I accept that, first of all, that these are copies, right? So it's not an original manuscript of Peter, so it wouldn't have the necessity of a relic in that sense. It was just something left, and it wasn't particularly useful given later theological efforts, and so it could have just been overlooked and forgotten, like you say at that point, because Peter of Verona's letter was forgotten. The one certain letter we have from him, it was just inserted in a sort of a spiritual book for nuns that's found in the Prague Metropolitan Library. And so just like this, it's almost an accidental survival from him. But for all those reasons, I'm grateful for these great questions. I wanted in this to bring out this polemical document for the students and make them read through the interminable scriptural quotations. But that's all part of it. I mean, you can't just take out the fun bits like Kepley did or Wakefield and Evans. You've got to wade through the arguments and the citations and authorities too, because that's how medieval arguments proceeded. I wanted to illustrate in this the centrality of the incarnational response of the Inquisition, the very bodiliness of the church's response, the goodness of marriage, the goodness of sainthood and relics, and particularly its appeal to lay religiosity. I think that his emphasis and his anger, his palpable anger in the heretics' contentions about Mary in particular, dovetails with the rise of the confraternities and the Marian confraternities that served as the very often inquisitional adjuncts in order to help the Inquisition in its efforts. And so I hope this provides a new window in the primitive or the evolutionary Inquisition before Ad Extirpanda, where it becomes kind of, this is where we got into the trap of saying the medieval Inquisition before that was dismantled. The Inquisitions, and it's almost barely Inquisitions before 1252, are spontaneous, local, episcopal, lay-supported, occasional papal interventions. It's a mishmash. It's a hodgepodge. I hope to throw a light on education in the early Dominican order. As I say in my book on Thomas, it seems to be that the people who entered the Dominican order in the first generation were educated in the arts, were exposed to Aristotle, and because of that, they neglected to develop the Aristotelian character of Dominican education, so that for about 20 years, there was a real hiatus until, and I know Klaus-Bernward has worked on Albert, until Albert and Thomas come and sort of revive that flagging. So the second generation of Dominicans really is not exposed to Aristotle as much. The amount of Aristotle in this text is both evidence of the education of the author and the character of the primitive order of the first 10 or 15 years. And I hope it's also helpful to historians to show Dominican preaching and disputation on the ground. What did it look like to work day to day as a Dominican preacher and a Dominican inquisitor in this early period, and which is why I propose this as a vademecum, as Reima was stressing. But thank you again, everyone, for these comments, and thank you for coming out. I'm so grateful. Editing is a lonely task, but it's also collaborative, because all of your work has gone in to help us to do things like this, to contextualize these things. And so as singular as academic, particularly historical academic work and paleographical work is, it's always part of that cloud of witnesses, which Peter cites on several occasions in the Summa. So thanks very much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Don. And I think We have one question so far from Manu Radhakrishnan, asking whether there were any translations made of Peter's work.
No translations, because it was quickly forgotten. If we look at Moneta or Reinario, I don't believe Reinario may have a late vernacular translation. I'm not sure, but for the theological works, everybody that needed it and used it would have been conversant in Latin, and so there wasn't much. What you do start to get, and I think it's kind of suggestive, is there's references in Milan to the confraternities that Peter founded as scholae, and specifically for Christian lay adjuncts of the Inquisition, which may have been, I don't want to go out on a limb here, but may have been attempts at primitive catechesis in order to equip lay Christians to answer at least some charges of their neighbors about the Catholic faith. So no vernacular translations as far as I know.
But you think there would have been some sort of network of education, of some sort of popularization of basic theological concepts?
I mean, other than preaching, we don't see much of that. I mean, those are developments that really have to wait for the Catholic reform after the Council of Trent. But there's these suggestive hints that say that maybe that there was some further continuing education for the laity, at least in Milan, in the second half of the 13th century.
And I wonder, I don't know whether any of our panelists might be able to say, but how much they think that this text may have influenced other texts. Certainly in your footnotes, for example, there's constant reference to Moneta, for example, and whether he has actually had access to it, but whether this was, I mean, you tend to say that it's been set aside quite quickly, but whether it actually did have a longer term influence or not.
There's some marginalia that show that it was read quite often and that it was used in preaching, but that would just be a localized effect. There is no direct text in that's taken over by Reinario or Moneta from this Summa, and so I could not trace any particular influence of the text in later times.
So the cult of Peter really just ignored him as a writer.
Yes, it did entirely. I mean, he was a public face. If as much as Thomas was a saint of the text, Peter was a saint of the spoken word, and so that's what people remembered and passed on in terms of his cult. The writings were totally unimportant, and the letter, as I said, survived accidentally. But we have no sermons of Peter. Very few sermons survive from this period. Most of them are scholastic or later in the 13th century, or because they were these spontaneous public events that weren't set down. They were events of the moment, right? They were more events than they were texts.
We've had a question from John Arnold, who says, having just skimmed through the text at speed in the last hour, I'm curious as to why Peter provided responses by example for only a few topics, those looking perhaps as the sort of persuasion that might most effectively fall back for a lay audience.
Yeah, thanks, John, from Tulsa. Thanks for visiting, for coming to this. Because I think it was intended for inquisitors and for preachers. It wasn't intended as a book of exempla, for sure. I mean, those were already available and had multiplied by that time. So in a certain sense, they could use these to cross-reference their theological arguments with the book of preaching exempla, where they could get the stories to illustrate it with the laity. I think just different purposes.
There's a question on whether you mentioned confraternities adjuncts of the Inquisition. Please, could you say more on this? This is from Rosemary Hayes. I work on 15th century England and have always thought they came from lay religiosity, not from the clergy. Perhaps you could speak, and then perhaps Klaus-Bernward could speak as well, Don.
Just briefly, because I want to hear what Klaus-Bernward has to say. They certainly spring from lay religiosity, increased lay desire for religious life and experience, but they were quickly co-opted, particularly by the Dominicans in the 13th century, and redirected in the directions that they wanted, particularly as adjuncts of the Inquisition, or to provide a firewall, I would say, by Marian devotion and devotion to particular saints in order to create that fire break for heresy, I think. But it was definitely lay religiosity.
Klaus, would you?
Not directly confraternities, but there's some late medieval examples of lay participation in the execution of heretics. So that wonderful documents from, I think, 1450s from the Benedictine monastery of Melk. 2 monks seek dispensation from the Pope because they are on a clerical career, but then they were uncertain if they had an impediment because as young boys they had carried wood to the pyres where early Hussites were burned in Austria in 1420s. So just in case they sought out, and this tells that if you think about young boys building the pyre for heretics, you start to think about the lay community being more anti-heretical than anti-Inquisition at that point.
I would like to see from the beginning, or from the 13th century, there was, let's say, militant lays, Militia Jesu Christi. There were lay people who kind of attended what inquisitors did. There were those, let's say, attracted to the whole complex, I would say, who supported, let's say, the effort for faith, who were interested in what the Dominicans offered additionally, brotherhood, Marian devotion. So I believe, let's say, it was a very conflicting thing, surely, that went through families, that divided cities, that ran through laity, and not all who were kind of not supporting the Inquisition were heretics themselves. It's again my question about the plurality and the sources, how to do justice. Was it a big non-support or big support? From what parts? And let's say it's difficult to claim what the support groups actually are. I mean, we have the brotherhoods, and we have the attraction to the Dominicans, we have or Franciscans, surely. So I've got difficulties to answer, actually. I believe I first must get the sources clearer.
I think there is a bigger question that's been brought up here about the role of the laity generally, and laity's interest in orthodox belief, which we start to see in things like the production of vernacular poetry in the early 13th century is not really linked to heresy. I think it's just a general interest in what should we be believing at the moment, and what are the key devotional practices to be adopting. As things are changing, I think quite radically over the late 12th century, the cult of the Virgin becoming more and more strong, and bringing with it, particularly monastic and clerical environments, and then bringing the laity with it, and perhaps the laity involvement in anti-heretical movement is actually just a function of that. It's a knock-on effect rather than actually to the forefront, possibly. We have a comment from Augustine Thompson, but perhaps I'll just bring him into the discussion because I think he perhaps has something more to say, probably about the role of and with a fantastic backdrop.
It's my monastery. No, my comment was merely that I agree with Don that trying to detect what went on in sermons on the popular level in the early 13th century is almost impossible. I mentioned that there is a manuscript of Ambrose Sansidoni's sermon notes, never published. I started scribbling to transcribe it and said, this is just too jumbled. But even that, it was very difficult to move from that text to what he was actually doing. When I worked on preaching in that period, I was more interested in what they were doing than what they were saying, because it was easier to reconstruct that.
We have a question from a fellow editor of Medieval Monographs, Stephen Mossman, who I'll bring in because I have no intention of humiliating myself with pronouncing German. So here's Stephen.
Hello, it's very good to see you all. My question is a very general one, which is really where you see the direction of the study of medieval heresy and Inquisition. Where ought it to turn in the next decade, in the next 20 years? And where are the real Forschungsdesiderate? There's been, do we need another book on the subject of the Cathars as a real or a reality or not? Where are the areas where there is still very poorly understood territory, but lots of material there that ought to be uncovered?
But perhaps we should go round. So Reima, you're at the top of my screen.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, that is a general question. Some things in my mind. What I hope that even in the current academic milieu, requiring us to publish quickly and a lot, we still would have time to do what Don has done, so edit unedited texts. There are some clear desiderata. One recently pointed out by John Arnold of Benedict of Alignan's Tractatus Fidei, an important work which actually spread also unedited, hardly used by scholars. And interestingly enough, when finishing my book on Peter Zwicker and late medieval Inquisition against Waldensians, together with John, we found out that Zwicker knew Tractatus Fidei treatise and took parts of it to his Refutatio Errorum. So I hope that we would expand the available sources also in the future. Otherwise, this is a kind of personal interest. I would like to see the late medieval heresy, particularly Hussites, integrated to the general discussion about heresy and Inquisition, they are treated as a bit separate phenomenon, and there are very few English-speaking or scholars publishing in English working on the Hussite. So, and of course, they were very real heretics. There were no question about them kicking ass of the German Crusaders. So we don't have to ponder upon that. But for the contemporaries, especially in the early period, when you read sermons and treatises from, for example, from the Council of Constance and then Council of Basel, they are referring to earlier polemics against Cathars, against Waldensians. They see the Hussites in the same high medieval tradition and not as a separate phenomenon. So and there are a wealth of sources, dozens of treatises. Simply look at the Repertorium Pavel Sukup has published online. So there's lots of work which are done, also probably unknown archival sources from the 15th century. But of course, that's personal interest. I'm a scholar of the late Middle Ages.
May I add? Let's say the situation is difficult. I'd say on the one hand, inquisitorial archives disappeared completely. The Cologne Inquisitorial Archive was given to the paper mill. So nothing's left. Occasionally, you can find some hints, but hidden. On the other hand, lots of treatises and tracts haven't been published. The Hussites are very popular, or were very popular, but let's say nobody does that effort like Don did in Peter's Martyr's Summa. It will take ages. They are usually long. And let's say there are many who do that kind of work. But the sources aren't everything. I believe, let's say, that we still have to grapple with public opinion and do more that the public knows what researchers know. And I believe that's very much a task still to be done. I believe, let's say, the comparison of inquisitions would be a focal point. No inquisition in England. Let's say in some parts of Spain, inquisition. So what happened in different countries at the same time? Can you actually compare Le Bougre in France with Konrad von Marburg in Germany at fairly the same time? Was it an effort to put new or Roman law into practice, or was it just, as Don said, very charismatic? And was that positive or negative? Because it had both aspects that you see full of enthusiasm. Peter Martyr preached, but at the same time, let's see, sometimes too much. enthusiasm. And I believe, let's say, there are lots of topics on individual inquisitors, on cities, or on whole areas during a specific time or in the long durée. So I believe inquisitional research won't run out during the next 100 years. But let's say, usually I'm delighted, let's say, that different people have different focuses. There is more than 3 volumes on bibliography on the Inquisition, and still much more needs to be done. I believe, let's say, I like the topics nobody likes. Like in Germany, my idea is it was kind of weak. But let's say you get hints in different cities, but it takes awfully long to find them. And that interests me, that you occasionally can find a very small reference in the manuscript that sometimes you get a chart or a document, and if you add it, you see it kind of covered the whole of Germany, but only occasionally, and only not very intense. And then at some times it was very strong in the East, having to do with personalities of inquisitors, but coming together, the support of princes, of bishops, and then at other times, it kind of decreased. And the question is, weren't the people that interested, that eager, the laity, the inquisitors? But still, let's say, things are to be found. And so I believe we have to follow, to some degree, what sources tell us. To some degree, we have to take our questions to the text. But there's still much to be discovered. And I believe, let's say, the laity was not the laity either, structured between nobility, between university students and teachers. So many things to explore. Actually, let's say a book could be done or should be done, how, let's say, different universities position themselves towards the Inquisition, towards the Hussite threat, towards Waldensianism. So I believe there are innumerable topics to explore. So in a way, I can't answer your question. because it's simply too much.
May I pick up on that and ask a direct question to Dawn? By the way, our house library has ordered the edition, and I got the PDF day before yesterday. I hadn't had a chance to look at anything but the table of contents. Is there any evidence of use of Roman law in this document?
I don't see any. There's some scattered references to canon law, but it doesn't not appear to have a legal education of much, which is maybe surprising because he went to Bologna, but I think he joined the Dominican order before he would have, he was probably destined for the law, but left before he took any formal law courses. Father Augustine, I remember taking medieval heresy from you, so I would be curious to see where you think the field is going or should go.
This is an area that has been, not even on the back burner for me for a long time. Most of what I've been hearing about study of medieval heresy recently has been from you, Don. So I don't want to play the prophet.
Christine, do you have any
thoughts about the future? Yeah. Obviously, I do think that, as people have said, and as I talked about in my presentation, we need to spend a lot more time on the laity and these relationships. Something I would say, though, obviously more additions are desirable, but something I would actually wish for that is more modest. I think we should actually pay more attention to the translations that we already have, and I think that we should actually simply be translating more. For example, the Fournier dossier is the sort of thing that we frequently talk about and talk around, but don't actually study in any great detail. And I think another good example is how often we appeal only to one part, say, of Bernard Guy's Inquisitorial Manual, or how often we refer to the French translation of Bernard Guy's Inquisitorial Manual, as opposed to looking at it in its entirety. And so certainly one thing I hope we would do, even in terms of research as well, actually, as teaching, is simply to mine better what we already have. Something else I would say about the future is, I do think, to go back to something that Stephen pointed out, I think that the entire debate about skeptics and traditionalists should be thrown in the trash can, with apologies to anyone attending who is a full-throated partisan one way or the other. I think that debate is enervated, and I think we should simply move on from it. And I hope that all of us could agree on that we've pretty much mined everything that we can out of that. One thing I would also hope, though, I guess two things. I hope that in the field, we spend a little bit more time, and this is a kind of a hobby horse of mine. I would hope that we would spend a little bit more time interrogating how all of these relationships between inquisitors and laity, the works by inquisitors, the conversations that are going on, how that is affecting simply understandings and meanings of religion in the Middle Ages, sort of in a much broader sense. So not just, say, understandings of Christianity, Christian faith, piety, devotion, but more generally, how those conversations, treatises, everything else are, again, affecting everybody's notion of what this thing called religion is. And I think the last thing I would hope that we would maybe take on in scholarship in the next few years, and this will sound a little bit maybe punk rock, and I apologize for that, I wonder if we should actually decouple a little bit more heresy and Inquisition in our scholarship. And I'm thinking, say, of course, Andy Kelly, who has encouraged us a million times over to make it very clear when we're talking about heresy Inquisition, and to get rid of this idea that all Inquisition is heresy Inquisition. But I wonder if in scholarship we should maybe attend a little bit more to the fact that heresy and Inquisition as a unit are a historical anomaly. That heresy normally exists without Inquisition, and Inquisition is something that obviously supersedes heresy, as everyone here knows. And so I wonder if in the future, in scholarship, it actually makes more sense for us to understand heresy inquisitions as part of a bigger concept, a bigger legal phenomenon that is Inquisition, and if that might help us maybe in unexpected ways to understand heresy inquisitions. So that's what I would say.
I just wanted to chime in on Christine's call for use of more translations that we have. In particular, the Fournier Register is something I would love to have more of to use with students. David Burr started to translate it and sent me parts of what he had done, but he never brought it to fruition and never published it as far as I know. If anyone here, I can dig through my files. If anyone here would like them, send me an email. After he produced them, I used them regularly in the seminar that Don was talking about.
Manu Rodriguez has a question, I think, so I'm bringing him in. I was just about to bring John in, but he's disappeared. So.
I don't know whether you can see or hear me.
We can hear you.
Oh, good, super. I have a question because I study a Dominican from Pisa, who's the most important translator of Latin religious texts into the vernacular for the laity. And one of the texts that he translates is the Book of Acts. And I have a question for each of the members of the audience. I suspect, but he doesn't say anything in the prologue, that the reason for translating the Book of Acts is in a response to the presence of the followers of Fra Dolcino and the apostology. And in fact, when I first saw, my Dominican is named Domenico Cavalca, dies in 1341, was at the Pisan convent. I was so astonished that he had translated the Book of Acts. I would have expected him rather to have translated one of the four Gospels, and of the four to have translated Matthew. For it seemed to me that given how fraught interpretations of what the Vita Apostolica was, both for clergy and for the laity, that this was perhaps opening up a can of worms, but maybe this is my own imaginative failure. So so really my question is, he doesn't say anything in the prologue. So he doesn't say the reason I'm doing this is to counteract the followers of Fra Dolcino, but subsequent to his translations, in his treatises, he does talk about heresy a good deal. So I'm just wondering if you were a Dominican translator in the early 14th century and had to translate one book of the Bible, which book would you translate?
Don, I think you should start.
Well, Peter uses Acts extensively in the Summa, and if you're going to argue ecclesiology with someone who is interested in scriptural data, then I think Acts is very useful. He uses it for sacramental theology, he uses it for ecclesiology, and even some of the theological arguments on the Trinity. So I think it was eminently useful for anti-church sentiment. For meeting anti-church sentiment. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
Would any of the other panelists disagree?
Yes, I'm no expert of Italian vernacular Bible translations, but I know that they were far more common than, let's say, German ones, which also existed. But what I know is that the Acts were one of the Bible books favored by Waldensians, for example, and therefore they were also a suspect text. Owning a vernacular translation of the Book of Acts could bring up accusations of heresy. So yes, it would be certainly possible that if a Dominican friar wanted to have a safe, uncontroversial translation of Book of Acts that could have been directed against heretics.
I am not going to say what I think would be a good choice for a Dominican to have translated, but when I think of Fra Dolcino and a whole bunch of similar movements, the book I wouldn't translate, because I wouldn't want people reading in private sessions is the Book of Revelation.
Sure.
The later Dominican commentary by Anius of Viterbo in the late 15th century causes enormous problems. So I think I'd share Father Augustine's view of that, but really, you really don't want that out there. Chris Fadal has quite a long comment, really, mainly to Christine. So I'll allow him to speak.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
You guys can hear me?
Yeah.
Should I just read my question?
Yeah. Do you want to read it?
I want you guys to bear with me because it's a bit of a philosophical question, and I'm not really an expert in the field, but I have been enjoying this panel, and so I'm just going to read the question now. Christine's comments about the future of Inquisitional studies has really intrigued me. I personally wonder just how much of a hamper, just how much of a hindrance being disconnected, as it were, as an atheist, as it were, from a mindset that encouraged scorching and impaling people for their beliefs is for a scholar. Could we not rather consider it a wonderful postmodern and, dare I say, Nietzschean skill to be able to suspend judgment and belief as we scavenge documenta of days of yore? As Etienne Gilson, despite being a proponent of Christianity, wrote about 100 years ago in his Études de philosophie médiévale, we shall always attain an understanding of that which we no longer know, and which the men of the 9th century knew. And hereby, men of 9th century, I hope we understand just men of the medieval ages in general. But we shall never be able to forget that which they knew not, and which we do. Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple of things I would say to that. One is that I actually think there's a paradox in your comment. I, as a disciple of Henry Charles Lay, certainly believe in the suspension of judgment in the same way that Lay did, and really using the same terms that he did. But I think I perceive at least a fair amount of judgment in the first part of your comment. So what is slightly striking to me is that it seems that the premise in the first part of your comment, I wonder just how much of a hamper being disconnected, as it were, from a mindset that encouraged scorching and impaling people for their beliefs. And then, of course, you seem to be advocating the suspension of judgment. And what I would say is, what has always been important in the study of Inquisition is precisely a zeroing in and emphasizing and critiquing of the particular belief system that led to impaling and scorching. Whereas people have not been as eager to interrogate and to condemn other motivations, other reasons, other purposes for scorching and impaling. That is, I think a lot of us in the field forever, and the field just itself has again looked with a very placid eye upon other forms of violence throughout certainly the Middle Ages as well as in the modern world. And what has always been interesting to me is why it is, again, consistently over the past several centuries, why it is the very fact that that violence has a religious motivation has particularly condemned it. And again, I see that as a Christian hangover among both people who are believing Christians and people who are not. The inability to look at inquisitorial violence in a way much like other forms of medieval violence. This is the sort of thing that comes up with students all the time, right? They talk about people who are being burnt at the stake, and again, adopt a very particular sort of condemnatory tone about this in a way that they don't talk about, say, medieval violence and warfare. Like, that's just sort of understood, that's a given, okay, people did that for whatever particular reasons. And so what, again, is interesting to me is how, when the West really does shed this kind of Christian hangover, and I'm mixing my metaphors, when can we look at inquisitorial violence? Again, not with the critique that I do see embedded in the first part of your comment. how can we look at it again in a dispassionate way? And yes, precisely that, suspend judgment, suspend any sense of endorsement, any sense of condemnation, and simply look at it as a form of institutional violence. I'm not sure I'm really answering your question. Obviously, I'm not an advocate of inquisitorial violence, but by the same token, I also don't believe that inquisitorial violence should get a particular sort of condemnation, again, that other forms of violence do not. I think that that does hamper us as scholars. I think that it has consistently hampered us as scholars. And that's something, again, I wonder how we break out of either the sense of affirmation or, again, this overt sense of condemnation. Again, I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it does a little bit.
Chris says that's a fair answer. Thank you. I suppose also historically we're living at the end of liberalism where freedom of ideas was the important thing. So that was the thing that you would zero in on for any form of constraint. And now maybe we're much less concerned about freedom of ideas. John has joined us finally.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and everybody. Sorry, something went technically wrong when Anthony was attempting to invite me in. And thank you, Don, for an amazing production. And one of the things I'm going to do when I get some time next week is now look through my extensive notes on the lengthy Benedictine Alley.
John, your mic isn't working. We can't hear you.
Hold on. Okay, am I audible now? Okay, sorry for that. Okay, thank you very much for letting me on. Thank you, Don, for an amazing production, and I'm going to be looking straight away at the Benedict of Avignon treatise to see if I can see if Benedict plagiarized this as he did so many other things. And just because Reima was kind enough to bring that one up, I wanted to say in this particular company that I have absolutely no intention of editing the Benedict of Avignon treatise myself, and therefore if anybody has PhD students or grants or indeed retirement projects they wish to take on, please do go ahead, and I will throw lots of electronic files at you if you want to do it. And I just wanted to pick up on things that everyone was talking about with regard to the future of study. Christine, I hope, will be pleased to hear that my current project is a book about the laity in the south of France, in which those who some of us still sometimes will call Cathars figure, but are not the main arguments. And I think, and I know what she means about the argument within the field has become less and less productive. I think it's still a challenge about how it's consumed by our colleagues more broadly. And I think that's a bit of an issue for all of us, but I know she feels that acutely in the same way I do. I just wanted to then flag up one thing which I think is parallel to Christine's points about thinking around heresy more broadly, and her points about thinking about inquisitorial violence more broadly, and about thinking of inquisitions other than heretical ones. I think that there's a big bit of work that things have been contributed to, but I think that we can still do much more on, is the sort of revisiting Richard Kiekefer's argument about Inquisition as a process and not an institution, and however recognizing that there's been quite a lot of work that makes us think that, well, perhaps it is more institutional. Setting this, however, within the wider frame of what do we think an institution is at different moments in the Middle Ages and indeed in the early modern period. One of the things I've come to realize over the last couple of decades, as I've gotten to know the work of more early modernists, is that even once there is the Holy Office, it doesn't necessarily work as seamlessly and powerfully as one was led to believe. So I think there's something there which we can do, and where that interplay between polemical texts, the negotiation with different groups of laity, practicalities of power, the vagaries of different inquisitors, certainly, but in a sense also this sort of wider sense of what does power that is not simply individual power, but is some part of a larger framework of power, what sense does that operate? And I think just to finish and bring us back to our core focus of the seminar, I think something that's interesting to consider within that is when we have these various polemical texts of the kind that Donald's now provided us with a new edition of, how they were thought to operate as well. As he said in answer to my earlier written question, almost certainly from the instruction of preachers and fellow Dominicans. And I'm curious in a way about how we think about the form of authority that circulates within those more limited spheres as well, and think about the polemics not necessarily as a kind of medieval version of Fox News, but as a sort of mode in which particular groups talk to each other and framed their collective efforts, which then brings us back to some of Christine's points around how we should think about violence and the violence they do. Sorry for going on at length, particularly having been inaudible at the beginning.
I don't know, anyone would like to pick up any of that?
Just a short comment on the polemics. I certainly agree, and I think that we need more comparison. In fact, a project I'm doing or should be doing, it's delayed for various reasons now, is to look at the available texts and editions, probably in electronic format, and using some of the computational tools available of looking for implicit quotes, not only between polemics against heresy, but for example, polemics between mendicant orders and polemics against Islam, because yeah, where our time is limited, we can only read so many medieval texts, but one should expect that there are influences not explicitly stated also between different genres of polemics, also different other genres of texts. So yeah, I hope to present some results within the next 2 years of that. If I get it work, it's a bit of a high risk, high gain project, but we'll see.
Worthwhile noting that polemics with Islam actually predate the polemics with heretics by quite a bit, and possibly a lot of the argumentative techniques are being formed with Islam, which, as we know, is a set of Christian heresies. So that, I mean, I think there probably is a quite a significant link there between what goes on and between one and the other. Meg Cormack has a question which I'll allow her to ask, bringing us back irretrievably to popular religion, I think.
Hi, this is just for Christine. So hi, say hi to South Carolina for me. And the question was just, you were talking about people's, and including scholars' ways of treating the Inquisition. And I was just wondering, are similar questions being asked about the witch hunts in the early modern period?
Hi, Meg. It is sunny and about 65 degrees here, as you will appreciate. I'm not sure I can actually answer that question. I just can't speak to attitudes towards violence against witches in the early modern period, other than in the most sort of cursory way. I mean, I do wonder if, and I don't know if my fellow panelists and attendees would agree, but I think it certainly comes down to notions of harm, right? And what I at least don't see a lot in the medieval inquisitorial sources, unlike, say, medieval sources on Jews, for example, there isn't a lot of focus and attention upon bodily harm done by heretics, certainly harm to the soul, right? And I'm just curious, and someone who knows the early modern period much better than I can should speak to this. I wonder if part of what would color clerical attitudes towards violence against witches in the early modern period is a notion of bodily harm versus harm to the soul. But again, that's super speculative. And again, I really can't answer your question, Megan. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that.
This is a random comment related to these two. The oldest example of a witch trial in Italy was in Todi in 1457. By the way, if you want this for teaching with students, Kate Jensen's source book, I did the translation for it. It was done by the secular government, and the major concern was the apparent ability of the witch to make children shrivel up and die. It's about violence. It's not about ideas. It's also an interesting text. When I use it, the students, I ask them to read it as if this was a court case you were in, and probably 80% of them, by the time they get through it, will say, you know what? If I were there, I would have thought she was a witch. And there's no evidence that she was tortured by the Todi government. So I agree with that I think the issues for witches have to do with physical violence, a perception that they inflict physical violence.
I'd say witches is a much more complex phenomenon. There is harm they did. There is then, let's say, the heresy they did. There is, that's why it's called, let's say, what Germans call a cumulative understanding of witchcraft, that it comes from different directions, while Inquisition is fairly straightforward. It's only centering on matters of faith. Surely not, that doesn't cover everything what the Inquisition did, but let's say the main focus is on faith. Let's say in the German law or common law, Carolina of the 1530s, they say there must be some harm done. But then, let's say, witchcraft at different times, some Germanic, some, but let's say that it was persecuted only started at the Council of Basel, that there were discussions about it. So it's a relatively late offspring of that kind of violence, and it only got actually stronger at the end of the century, and then after a break, excuse me, in the 17th century again. So there is no continuous, let's say, fight against witchcraft, and the Inquisition was relatively late in taking it up. Let's say Institores didn't was definitely disliked by his fellow Dominicans. Sprenger even arrested him because he said it's a fake, and he is well, let's say, making things up, witches who steal penises, whatever it is, and witchcraft must be seen, let's say, on a slightly different track. And apart from that, it was mostly not the Inquisition that dealt with it, but secular authorities, even episcopal secular authorities. So in a way, it must be judged a bit differently.
On that theme, one of the interesting things of the text that I just mentioned is that it has no diabolical pact, and the heresy of witchcraft is connected with devil worship. And I think also the thing that slows the church courts down on getting involved in is the canon episcopi, which they have to, well, erase, since it says there are no witches. And admittedly, the text I mentioned is the earliest one in Italy.
Delfinieto has a comment, and I'll just bring them in.
Hi there. I just wanted to add to Father Thompson's comment that in Catalonia, we also have sources on witchcraft in the first quarter of the 15th century. And then again, it's violence, and especially violence against children, and witches allegedly shriveling up children and entering houses through small cracks in the wall and basically doing harm to children. And actually, we've had for quite some time the sort of friendly argument between people working on heresy and people working on witchcraft here. And we always draw the same conclusion, and it's that the biggest difference, and especially connected to what Christine was saying about the involvement of the laity, it's precisely that here, at least, the laity don't perceive heretics as a bodily threat, as if they might do them bodily harm, whereas witches are perceived from the very first moment as a danger to the community. And that's why the persecution of witches, at least here, is a bit of a bottom-up thing, whereas heretics are persecuted more in a top-down way. If I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but I just wanted to add that. Thanks, by the way, for everything you said. It's been really, really interesting.
There is just incidentally, if I can get back to heretics away from witches for a second, that at least before 1252, there is a real threat of physical violence from heretics. The author of this Summa speaks as if he went sort of barnstorming into a heretical meeting and got into a fight in one passage. And we know that Peter himself was not opposed to this because he led a massive street brawl in Florence in 1244. And so there was some physical threat. And this is, we see this with the lay Inquisition retainers and with the application of crusading indulgences to urban warfare against the heretics in the 13th century as well. So there might be some bodily threat from them.
Reima, you were going to...
Yeah, commenting on the diabolical side, it is intriguing that in the 14th century, there seems to be a reluctance, especially on part of the clerical elite, to accept these rumors of pacts with the devil. For example, in 14th century Germany, there were circulating popular rumors about Luciferians, devil-worshipping heretics, and most often they refer to Waldensians, as Alexander Pachowski has proven many years ago. But Peter Zwicker is an example of an inquisitor who, in his Inquisition, tells that there is a pharma against heretics based on the Luciferian rumors, and then dismisses them completely, saying that they are not related to these heretics, and goes on with his own interrogatorium. So he simply does not seem to believe that devil-worshipping heretics existed in his own time and place. They may have existed somewhere.
Yeah, well, let's say in the 13th century, Papal bulls, Vox in Rama, claimed there was the involvement of the devil, but let's say nowadays it's mostly taken as a papal opinion, which is not necessarily true. And I believe, let's say, regarding heretics and violence, let's say, in the later Middle Ages, there were lots of heretics, sure, but let's say their cases were very individual. Sometimes 20 or 30 should be prosecuted, but I get the impression not a relevant part of a landscape, a town that was in a way organized and could, let's say, attack or for some reason, even if they were organized, they didn't use it for, let's say, resistance or fighting the Inquisition.
I was just wondering what Don was saying, really, whether the struggle between heretics and the Orthodox, say, is just another feature of general urban tensions that really, it's extremely difficult for people to live in cities, and wholly unnatural. So something has to give, and perhaps we should look at what was happening to the heretics in much the same way as what happens to Jews in Spain in the 1390s, that something gives and violence is the response. So I don't know whether it's a constant of medieval urban life, is that really, you're constantly looking for people to beat up, really.
Yeah, no, exactly, especially in Italian urban life. I mean, and it mixes together with politics, and it mixes together with all sorts of factional rivalries and class rivalries as well. So, I mean, it's part and parcel.
It brings us back to Christine's point about different types of violence which we ignore, and other types of violence which we really zero in on. So we don't have a good map, for example, of what's happening in Spanish towns in 1390s. We have a really good map of what happens to Jews in Spanish towns in 1390s. But we don't have a good map of what happens in Spanish towns, where actually it looks like the whole urban fabric is collapsing and towns are merging and people are building fortresses around their towns, actually because everything. Christine.
Well, I think that's maybe a huge, ugly general distinction to be drawn, to get back to Meg's question, is that it seems that the violence that we see, particularly the urban violence having to do with heresy, it's a bug and not a feature, right? It's not considered to be a structural sort of theological component of their identity, their practice, in the way that I think we do see with witchcraft. And so while certainly there is violence, and getting back to the Biscaro accounts that I mentioned really briefly in my presentation, when we have all of those different inquisitorial accounts from about 1285 to 1310, you do see also references to violence, right? An inquisitor who has his face slapped. And we still see this in the Fournier dossier, this idea that heretics at this point, they're willing to murder informers, right? And there is always this sort of violence that is peppered. But it's interesting to think that sort of in terms of a broad kind of theological narrative, violence simply doesn't play the same role, right, in ecclesiastical understandings of heresy as it will later in witchcraft. And so it is sort of interesting to think what direction that is going in. Is it because there is just a general context of urban violence by which then heretical violence is being understood? Or why is it that, again, sort of the nature of witchcraft starts embedding this idea that violence is part of the package? Again, in a way that it does with I think, with medieval Jews. Again, to issue another huge, ugly generalization.
Don and I have gone around on this, but one of the usual things, yes, Italian cities are very violent, and being in charge of the city means being able to chase your opposition out of the piazza, usually quite violently. But one of the most common accusations against the other faction is that they're heretics. So I think we need to think a lot harder on what's the rhetoric of the politics use of the term heretic and what ecclesiastics think heresy is about.
Yeah, there's an excellent example of this, how lay people were capable of adopting the clerical accusations in 1395, when there were Waldensian inquisitions going on all over the German-speaking Europe. In Rothenburg, Ob der Taube came up accusations against a leading citizen, Hans Wern, and for a long time it was considered as one case of Waldensian persecution, until about 2 decades ago, Ludwig Schnurrer found out in the city archives that it really was about a conflict between two leading citizens of the city, where one party picked up the circulating accusations against Waldensians, branded his opponent as a heretic. The problem was that this Hans Wern was a friend of several abbots and Bishop of Würzburg, and he could actually mobilize his own ecclesiastic network, and so it all fall apart. But it includes all the usual stuff of urban conflict, so street brawls and harming other parties' property and so on. So heresy was just one part of the general conflict between two very rich and influential men.
Chris Faddle's asking, Christine, when is your wine study coming out?
My wine study is now completely limited to my living room in the evenings. And unfortunately, my academic study of wine has been postponed in favor of my extracurricular wine study. So I'm sorry that I can't answer that question about a release date. I'm sorry for that.
It's just maturing, really, and becoming a bit vintage.
It is. It needs more time. It needs more time.
On that note, I think probably we have to draw everything to a close with, the future of the Inquisition studies will be actually viniculture and more writing about wine. So thank you to all of the panelists and to Don for this amazing work, which is available in hard copy at half price to members of the society. Society membership is very cheap as well. And thank you to everyone who's attended and who've asked such marvelous questions. It can be purchased, as Stephen says, at Avon Space NS 38. So we're going to close things down now, but thank you to all of you, and it's been a great session. Thank you.